Carole is currently a police lieutenant with the San Diego Police Department and has been with that department since 1995. So welcome, Carole. And we've got community members and city council members that have signed in. So we've asked them to use the raise hand feature when they have a question. So we'll just wait for a moment and see what pops up.
Yeah, sounds good. Awesome.
I know Amanda has a question. Amanda, did you just want to start today?
Sure.
Sounds perfect. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I live in Shelton. I own a house here, and I'm just kind of here as a resident. Shelton is a really surprisingly purple city, and recently that has led to some tension in our downtown area. While most everyone in our community recognizes open carry laws, we've seen some behavior that seriously pushes the boundaries of open carry. So my question is, how will you address the issue of civilians brandishing firearms and weapons on public streets in an intimidating fashion?
Wow. You know, Amanda, I watched some videos recently from the protest that you had back in September. And that was one of the first things that I noticed is that folks were open carrying weapons. And brandishing is very different than open carry. Brandishing is more of a crime of pointing those weapons. And of course, that needs to be addressed immediately. One of the things that I would want to do in a situation if I knew that there were protests would be to get in touch with those organizers, try to talk to them and see if we could talk about those things ahead of time. Because the difference between having a slung rifle in front of you and bringing it up and opening fire on a crowd takes 1 second. So I would like to have those conversations. It's important to let people have that opportunity to demonstrate and talk about what they feel are the injustices of the world. But it's quite another to do that in a way that makes people feel unsafe to do that. And as I watched, I was really impressed with how the officers handled that situation. But if we could convince folks ahead of time that even if they're bringing them in there, they have zero intention of using it, if it incites someone else to use it, then we have a problem. So I'd like to have that conversation with both sides to see if we could come up with an agreement not to have them in those situations, because it takes so little to go from a peaceful protest to violence in our streets. So that would be the first thing I would want to do, is try to talk to people and make sure that they're going to be there and be safe and not make anyone feel threatened, even if that wasn't their intention.
Awesome. Thank you, Carole. It looks like we have a question from Councilmember Schmidt. So Councilmember Schmidt, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, just a follow up to that question, Carole. You know, you hit the nail on the head, which is how do you got to communicate with the individual groups, and that was something that was done ahead of time. However, coming into this position as a new face with these contentious times that we're in, how would you initiate that trust building situation? How would you start off on the right foot, so that way when you do reach out and say, hey, you're going to have this demonstration, you're going to protest, you're going to counter protest, whatever you're going to do, hey, I'm the police chief, and I'm here to work with you in a safe way. So what's your experience been in building trust in the community to where people would listen to you and take what you had to say seriously and in the right way?
I think part of that conversation is going to have to be about transparency and showing examples of how these things can spin out of control very, very quickly. One of the things as a police chief, whether you're in San Diego or in Shelton, you have to look at what's going on in other places around the world, because if it's happening there's always the possibility that it's going to happen in your town. And being able to present those situations to folks and say, look, these folks may not have ever had an intention for this to turn violent, but this chain of events caused this to happen. And we don't want those same things to happen in our town. So I think coming in forearmed with the potential problems that could happen and what problems other communities have had, and trying to show that we're trying to learn from the mistakes of others, would go a long way towards showing that it doesn't take much at all for something to go from being very, very peaceful to being very, very violent. And no one wants to have that happen in their community.
Awesome. Thank you, Carol. It looks like our next question is from Heidi. So Heidi, go ahead.
Hi, Carol. Heidi McCutcheon, Shelton Mason County Chamber. I'm just interested in if you've had the chance to speak to any community members or business owners, what their perception of crime in Shelton is and what perhaps the biggest issue might be.
Heidi, unfortunately, I won't arrive in Shelton until tomorrow, but I did send a reconnaissance team up ahead of me, namely my husband Michael, and our 3 dogs actually arrived there yesterday. So he has actually been out there talking to folks. And I've spent a lot of time online reading different blogs where people talk about living in Shelton. If you Google, is it safe to live in Shelton? A lot of community members reach out and talk about what they think some of the issues are. I found that a lot of people thought that it was very safe, but at the same time, there were a lot of people that talked about drug problems in the community and how those drug problems make them feel unsafe, which would be issues that while getting that information online is not the same as actually being there and getting that information firsthand, it at least serves as a jumping off point. So my husband, he loves talking to people. So he spent his day going around going, hey, what do you think of Shelton? And he says that the folks that he talked to seem like they're very happy there. But then again, he's a stranger that walked in and said, hey, what do you think of Shelton? But I look forward to having that opportunity because I can't make educated decisions about what to do as a police chief unless I understand how the community feels about crime in that community.
Thank you, Carol. It looks like Amanda has another question. So Amanda, go ahead.
Thank you. How will you support de-escalation and mental health first aid training for officers?
Amanda, I love that you're so interested and invested in this process. I was on my department, I served as the mental health liaison for the San Diego Police Department for 2 years. And I spent a lot of time meeting with community groups about their fear of what would happen if they were to call law enforcement if one of their family members was in crisis. And one of the things that I learned is it's really important to explain to people what our procedures are, how we respond to different critical incidents, and have them explain to us what their issues are and how best to respond to them. I'm going to give an example. I had a meeting with an autism group of family members that had children that were autistic. And we've started brainstorming ideas of what we could do. This woman in particular, easy for me to say, she had a son that was autistic. He was a very large young man, and she feared if he ever got contacted by police that they would shoot him because he gets really worked up. And so we talked about ways that we could educate our officers on what autism looks like. And I think it's important for other mental health diagnoses to explain to our officers what it looked like. But on top of that, it's important to make sure our officers understand that time is their friend when it comes to responding to these crises, and that getting their resources in place ahead of time, coming up with a plan of what they're going to do, and getting a supervisor on scene will help keep a situation from spiraling out of control and end up with an unfortunate circumstance where violence has to be used against somebody that's just in a mental crisis.
Thank you, Carol. I know Amanda has another question. If you'd like to go ahead and ask that at this time, Amanda.
Yeah, just so you have the heads up, Carol asked like the same questions to everyone, so they already know that I'm asking. So, and others feel free to jump in. I don't want to take up too much space. So, but my next question is, where do you stand on cooperation with ICE, specifically with like ICE raids?
Well, Amanda, as a municipal law enforcement professional, my focus in law enforcement is to make people that live in the community feel safe. And that is regardless of whether or not they are in our community legally or illegally. I think the biggest travesty is for someone to be a victim of a crime or feel unsafe or need police assistance in some way, and be fearful to call and report what's happened because they're afraid that they're going to get deported. So I think it's important for us to stay in our lane and be the municipal police department and keep our community safe. Now, to that end, if ICE were in our area and those officers were in need of emergency assistance, then of course, we would have to go and aid them in that way. But dealing with immigration laws, that shouldn't be our focus. Our focus should be on keeping our community safe.
Awesome. Thank you, Carol. It looks like we have another question from Heidi. So Heidi, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm wondering, well, community-based policing is something that we hear a lot about. I'm wondering if you can share with us some of the relationships you've built out in your community and kind of some of the ways that you go about that.
The San Diego Police Department has been a pioneer in community-based policing as long as I've been on the department. I remember when I got on in about, I came on in 1995, but I didn't actually go out in the field until 96. And back then, it was all about coming up with your problem-oriented policing project. And then that has morphed into community policing. I learned a very, very valuable lesson when it comes to community policing. I was serving as a juvenile services team sergeant in one of our busier areas. And we would conduct curfew sweeps to try to keep kids from being victims of violent crime at night. And we had partnerships with our community to the point where people in the community would work in our command post. They would be the folks that were calling parents. They would help watch the kids while we were waiting for parents to show up. They would help check kids in. They took on all sorts of roles that would have been filled by officers if it weren't for their help. And because of that, we were far more effective and efficient as police officers. I could get more done with fewer officers because people in the community that were invested in helping their community, that wanted good things for their community, would come in and help us. And those relationships were so powerful that to this day, that's been 6-7 years ago. When I run into those folks in my community, it's like going to a family reunion. And I think that's the kind of relationship that police departments should be developing with their community. And once I had that experience, I was working on a homeless outreach team, and I took that experience and applied it to that position. Once I got there, I met with all of the different resource providers within my within my city, and met with them to find out what they do, what skills they could offer. And that ultimately morphed into what we called a coordinated outreach event, where they would send all of their outreach workers. They would partner with the police, and then we would go out and meet homeless people where they live and try to get them into resources. And because we were partnering with them, we were able to spread it out to a much larger group of people and potentially help them anymore. So I think community-oriented policing is not only a vital part of police work, but it certainly makes the police department more efficient and better informed about what's going on in their community.
Thank you, Carol. It looks like Councilmember Schmidt has another question.
If you could share with us a little bit, how do you recruit the next wave of police officers? Given the climate that we're in today, obviously, it may not be as an attractive of a job as it once was. How do you feel about that? And again, how do you draw the next wave of officers?
I think part of getting the next wave of officers comes from the professionalism that our police department shows to the community. Nobody would want to, first of all, I have to say, I think it's sad that that people would shy away from being in this field, because I think law enforcement is one of the most amazing career fields, because people can't live happy and productive lives unless they feel safe. And that's the police department's job, to make people feel safe. I think it's important to start instilling that in people when they're young, to show them those positive examples of police officers, especially in those situations where we have youth that have frequent encounters with the police, whether it be domestic violence or other crimes that are occurring in their neighborhood, to take that time and build those relationships with people and have those honest conversations about what that relationship should look like. I think that is the best place to start, is to explain to people what our job is. When I first started, the only thing I knew about police officers was what I saw on TV, you know, the car chases and the robberies, and it's so much more than that. And I think once people realize that it's far more about service than it is about guns and bank robberies and high-speed chases, that might help bolster some interest in our career as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Carole. I guess I'll ask a question that's probably going to seem like on a completely different topic, but why Shelton? I know San Diego to Shelton would be a huge jump. So what attracted you to this area or to the Shelton Police Department?
Well, when I first saw the job announcement, I didn't know anything about Shelton. So I started doing some research to see if I would be a good fit for your department. I started looking at all sorts of things on Google, from your budget for 2021 to what's on your Facebook page to Sheriff or Chief Moody's 5-year strategic plan, what his vision for the department is. Started looking at pictures of what the area is like, looked at what community members said. And the more I got to know about Shelton, the more I find that I love what I've seen of your little town. I can't wait to be there tomorrow to start getting to meet people in person and see for myself, because you can't really get a feel for a place until you're actually there. My husband retired earlier this year after 33 years on the San Diego Police Department, and he's always had this dream that he wants to live in an evergreen forest. Next month, I'm eligible to retire if I choose to. But I don't feel ready to do that. I still feel like I have stuff that I want to contribute. So this ended up being something that really appealed to me. He gets to live in his evergreen forest, and I still get to feel like I get to be part of a community. And I'm excited about learning about new law enforcement officers. You have an entire squad of officers that I've never met and who do policing differently than I do. And I'm really excited about the opportunity to learn Shelton's culture.
Thank you, Carole. Amanda, I see you popped up with another question here. Please go ahead.
Tony, Amanda.
Yeah, this one's kind of a tough one. And it comes from my experiences of having to manage people with difficult situations that come up. Can you tell us about a time that you responded to excessive use of force while on the job, maybe from a superior or a peer or someone that you supervised?
Amanda, I worked in internal affairs for about a year, and the whole purpose of that unit is to investigate either citizen complaints or internal investigations where someone has been accused of any kind of wrongdoing. And one of the cases that I investigated was an excessive use of force that I'd actually been called out on, where an officer had been in a pursuit with a known felon. The person ran across the freeway. There was a canine unit involved, and I guess the suspect at some point had tried to strangle the dog, and the canine handler lost control, and he, in my opinion, used excessive force. And so I have to be the objective fact finder and hold those folks accountable. It's so important in law enforcement, if someone is not being professional or is using excessive force or is mistreating the public, that they are found out and investigated and disciplined accordingly, because police work is hard enough when everybody's doing things right. But anytime someone does something wrong that tarnishes our reputation, it makes it harder for everyone. And it doesn't matter if it happened here, if it happened in any other jurisdiction. We have a responsibility to police our own and make sure that people are held accountable for their actions. Otherwise, we can't expect people to follow the police if the police aren't following the rules.
Thank you, Carol. So it looks like we have no new questions at this point. Did anyone else have any? Do we see a raise your hand from anyone at all?
Oh, looks like Amanda has a follow-up. So Amanda, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if you're familiar with emotional intelligence testing or maybe implicit bias testing. They're two kind of different things. So I'd love to hear you speak on both. Yeah, and just hear a little bit about that.
I mean, it's so funny that you would mention that. I've spent, part of the reason I couldn't get up to Shelton earlier is that I was signed up for a leadership mentoring and coaching class that I've been in for the last 3 days. And one of the days we spent a lot of time talking about emotional intelligence and how important it is for us as leaders to practice emotional intelligence and understand what our triggers are, and be able to look at how our emotional intelligence influences how we make decisions. If we don't remain self-aware of how our emotions are affecting us, then we can't really make good decisions. So it's critically important for us to always take that step back and look at why we're responding the way that we are. And as far as implicit bias, I think all of us have our biases. And I think that if we're able to recognize what they are, it helps us to counteract those effects. And it's also important for us, if we see others that it appears that they are showing some kind of a bias, to address that with them and bring it to their attention, because all of us could do better if we're more self-aware of what our triggers are, what things we are going to respond to. So I'm a huge proponent of giving our officers both training in emotional intelligence so that they can understand how their emotions affect their decision making, and an implicit bias so that they may make better informed decisions because they know themselves better.
Thank you, Carol. Councilmember Schmidt is going to follow up with the next question.
Tell us about a career defining moment, positive or negative.
A career defining moment. You know, I have one that years ago, when I first joined the police department back in 1995, all I wanted to do was be a homicide detective, because that's what all the cop shows are about. And I thought that would be really cool. So throughout my career, I had put all my eggs in that basket. I was going to be the best homicide detective. They were going to make TV shows about me. So I put in for detective. I didn't put in the first time I was eligible for it. I put in for the second time and the third time, and I didn't get those opportunities. So I went to one of my supervisors and said, you know, I've done all these things. I've taken all these classes. I've done this job. Why am I not getting this opportunity? And this person sat me down and told me that he thought I should be taking the sergeant's test instead. And I remember leaving that meeting with him being so frustrated. You know, I wanted to kick the door on my way out because he wasn't listening to me. And it turns out at the end of the day, I wasn't really listening to him. So fast forward just a couple of weeks after that, another supervisor sat down with me because my command had offered me an opportunity to be an acting sergeant, and I turned it down. And he sat down with me and said, "What are you doing? Why aren't you taking these opportunities?" And I had told him honestly that my fear was that I would make a decision that would get somebody hurt. And he told me the fact that I was even concerned about that was one of the reasons I should consider doing it. And he told me, he goes, do you think there's anybody that's in a leadership position that isn't worried about that, that doesn't worry that they're going to get somebody hurt because they made a bad decision? And in that moment, he convinced me to take one of those opportunities. And it truly changed the trajectory of my career, because what I realized in that moment is that being a law enforcement officer is not the best job in the world, despite all of my beliefs. Being the supervisor that gets to take care of those officers that are ultimately going to take care of your community is probably the most rewarding thing that I've ever gotten the opportunity to do. And if those two individuals hadn't taken the time to explore my reluctance to do anything but be step-aside homicide, I wouldn't be sitting here in front of you today.
Awesome. Thanks, Carole. And it looks like with maybe our last question, we have Amanda with one more question for you this evening.
Yeah, I actually just wanted a quick follow-up to my last question, which is, would you support implementing those types of trainings, emotional intelligence and implicit bias trainings within the Shelton Police Force if they're not already there? I don't actually know. So
I honestly don't know that either, but I would absolutely support that kind of training. Any kind of training that gives our officers more tools when they go out into the community so that they can make more informed decisions should be the goal of every police department. The better trained your officers are, the more tools they have in their tool belt. The ones that we wear around our waist are only, those are like the last resort tools. The ones that are in your head are the ones that you're going to use more often. The better trained our officers are, the more they know their own feelings, their own emotions, the better they're going to be able to respond to others. I can't stress enough how important it is for people to understand that the interactions that they have with people in the community is, you're going to have those kind of interactions far more often than you're going to use any of the other tools that are on your belt. So any kind of training that helps people understand themselves and others is invaluable.
Thank you, Carole.
Well, it looks like we have about 3 minutes left. So if anybody has a last question, it doesn't look like I'm seeing any. What do you think?
Yeah.
I think we're good. So thank you, Carole, for taking the time to spend a few minutes with us this evening.
It was truly my pleasure. Thank you so much. I really appreciated all the thoughtful questions. It's nice to see people that are really invested in choosing their next police chief.